It's wonderful to see you all. Hopefully you're able to get the source sheets, and this is kind of a follow-up in a certain way to a program we did just the other night in New York City. On Tuesday, we had a panel conversation. We partnered with the Hartman Institute and also with Hadar on this book called Circumventing the Law by Alana Steinhain. Hartman ran all the text, so hopefully the recording of that should be available soon. So if you're interested, please reach out to me if you didn't get a chance to see it. And so this was a class today that we're doing that I've been developing for some time, but certainly there were some additions based on this book and certainly on that class, on that session. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you have the source sheet. For those who are new, typically what we do is our website has the sources. I try and send them out as an attachment, and I also share my screen as we go through them. And then it's a bit frontal just because there are too many people to have a real conversation. And then towards the end, we'll have some time for conversation. Okay, so here we go. In an article that was published just 2 days ago in the online journal called Lair House, there's an article written by a Mormon about his experience buying chametz from a Jew, buying leavened product from a Jew. And he writes, I think whimsically and beautifully, he says, in a lovely spring garden in suburban Philadelphia, which is where I'm from, I handed cash and a handkerchief to my friend's rabbi. It was the first time that I, an observant Latter-day Saint, a Mormon, had ever purchased whiskey. Latter-day Saints are prohibited from consuming alcohol, although they are permitted to own it. For the next 2 weeks, however, I would own a large store of booze, along with a number of half-used boxes of breakfast cereal and a lease on a very nice apartment in Jerusalem. At the suggestion of my friend Chaim Saiman, who's a law professor at Villanova, I had agreed to act as a friendly Gentile, purchasing the unused chametz or leavened foodstuffs and its storage locations that the members of his synagogue were prohibited from owning during Passover. At the conclusion of the holiday, I could, if I so chose, sell the whiskey back to its original owners. So many of you may be familiar with this practice, some of you may not be. But basically, we're going to learn today some of the background of why this practice should even exist altogether. Look at the foundational sources in the Torah about owning chametz, or leavened product, on Pesach. And then we'll take a look at sort of where this practice emerged for selling chametz, and then as a loophole, and also how that loophole evolved a bit over time and in different sources. And then ultimately, we're going to conclude by looking at how this is an interesting case study of loopholes in general, and what they mean both in terms of how Jewish law evolves, but also how law evolves more generally. So to begin, we need to look at Exodus. We have a few different excerpts there. And first we read in Exodus 12 in Shemot Yud Bet, for 7 days, leavening agents shall not be found in your homes. For anyone who eats a leavened substance, that soul shall be excised from the assembly of Israel. Whether a stranger or a citizen of the land, you shall eat nothing leavened. In all your habitations shall ye eat unleavened bread. Oh, which, by the way, that is matzah. If you look at the Hebrew, that's matzah. So we have this term that you shouldn't find any leavened substance in your home. But that really is meant to actually be not just finding, but really owning. And in Exodus 13, we see something similar. Unleavened cake shall be eaten during the 7 days. Again, also matzot. And no leaven shall be seen of yours in your possession, and no leavening shall be seen of yours throughout all of your borders. So here, actually, these two verses kind of come together to be, in rabbinic parlance, the violation of owning chametz, but that's understood to be bal yira bal yimatze, not seeing and not finding. But those don't mean not seeing and not finding in their kind of colloquial sense, but understood through the canonical interpretation to mean not owning. So many of us are probably familiar with the concept that we eat matzah on Passover, and we're probably familiar with this practice to not eat bread or leavened product throughout Pesach. And then there's also this prohibition against owning chametz. And we see also, so that's a prohibition. We see sort of the a related positive obligation to get rid of your chametz also, and that's going back now to Exodus 12 in our fourth source on the page. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened cakes, but on the preceding day you shall remove. And this term is not entirely understood what it means, tashbitu, remove or destroy all leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leaven from the first day until the seventh day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. The seventh day here, of course, is because in the land of Israel, the days Passover 7 days long. Outside the land of Israel, like most other holidays, there's one additional day, so 8 days. But fundamentally, Passover is a 7-day holiday. Now we see also that there is a very strong punishment associated with this, which is called karet. That is kind of the highest order punishment from a heavenly level, and there are different understandings of precisely what that means. But most important for us, I think, is that to understand this is seen as being a very weighty prohibition, and that's the prohibition of eating chametz. But then it seems as if there's this associated, perhaps a kind of fence that the Torah is making around the Torah. We tend to think of fences as the rabbis make fences around the Torah, but sometimes the Torah also makes fences around other rules. That seemingly you shouldn't own this chametz lest you come to eat it, but it's not obvious that that's really what the Torah is saying, but it seems like that is the implication, the way it's written. But perhaps there's also just a greater taboo that we are placing on chametz during the time of Passover. And we can try and debate, or discuss why that should be the case. But I think, the argument would be that the story of Passover is this, primary story for us as a people. And this was the primary way in which Jews were instructed to recall the Exodus and to honor it, based on this notion that we, were in a rush, so our bread was unable to leaven, and therefore we only eat matzah, and so we shouldn't have any leavening to honor that experience. One could also say, why do we have this notion of excision, that we get excised from our people if we don't follow this? Perhaps there's a way in which, because this is our fundamental foundational story, I believe that Passover is the most widely observed Jewish observance in some form or another. And so there may be a way you can argue whether or not specifically eating leaven is the best way to honor that. But certainly I think Passover as a whole is still seen for many as being kind of the core way in which we identify with broader Jewish community and also our history. Okay, so these are basically the primary texts for not owning chametz on Pesach, and there's still a ways to go to our introduction here of this Mormon who was buying chametz. But we begin to see that at least Jews shouldn't own chametz on Passover. So how then does this get codified in Jewish texts? And where do we begin to see this question of selling chametz emerge? So here now we move to the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the original code of Jewish law. And there we see the following. For the entire time that it is permitted to eat leavened bread, and there's a debate just how long one can continue to eat even on the eve of Passover. It's for another time. But for the entire time that it is permitted to eat leavened bread, one may also feed it to his domesticated animals, to non-domesticated animals, and to birds. And one may sell it to a Gentile. So that's most relevant for us. And in general, it is permitted to derive benefit from it. After time passes, it is prohibited to derive benefit from it, and one may not even light an oven or a stove with leavened bread. So there's a general concept in Jewish law. There are some things that we're not allowed to do X, Y, or Z with, often with food, but we may still be able to derive other forms of benefit from it. But then there are some things that are also prohibited from deriving any benefit. So in this case, with chametz, we're not allowed to get any benefit from it. So by the way, one classic distinction with this would actually be meat and milk from the laws of keeping kosher. One is not allowed to derive benefit from them beyond just eating. But if one has, say, a cow that wasn't slaughtered in the appropriate way, that one could still actually sell. So it seems here there's a broader taboo against deriving any benefit at all from chametz. So not only can you eat it, you can't derive any benefit, and certainly selling it is also a form of benefit. So the Talmud then picks up on what seems like maybe it's unnecessary to state. And there we read, so long as one may eat chametz on Erev Pesach, Passover, one may feed it to an animal, wild birds, may sell it to a Gentile, this is quoting, and one may profit from it. So now the Talmud says, hold on a second, one may sell it to a Gentile, quoting from the Mishnah. That's obvious. I mean, why would that have needed to be stated? Seemingly, right, because it falls into the broader category maybe of deriving benefit. And it's wondering, why was it necessary to state explicitly that you are allowed to sell to a Gentile? And it explains the following. It says it needed to say that in order to exclude the one who taught in a Braita, which is another Mishnaic era text from the Tanaitic period, which is when the Code of Jewish Law was compiled and what's comprised of. There's a statement there that Beit Shammai say that one may not sell their chametz to a Gentile unless the Gentile will consume it before Passover. And Beit Hillel say, for the entire time that it is permitted for a Jew to eat leavened bread, it is also permitted for him to sell it to a Gentile. So we see here that Beit Shammai seems quite strict to say that not only should I not myself chametz, but if I sell it, in some ways I'm still attached to this chametz and how it's then going to be used. And potentially one might argue that I'm sort of indirectly deriving benefit from this chametz if I sell it to someone else who's not obligated, by the way, in not owning chametz to a non-Jew here. I sell it to them, but then they're going to be eating it over the course of Passover. There's a way in which the money that I'm receiving is kind of in exchange for a benefit of chametz on Pesach. So that's Beit Shammai's position. And Beit Hillel, I think, offers the more clear understanding, I think, which is slightly more intuitive, which is to say, no, I shouldn't be able to sell it on Passover, but I'm allowed to sell it beforehand. But we already see here right now the Talmud is debating this question of selling. This does not seem to have anything to do with the question of selling it in order to get out of owning it. It's just a general question through day-to-day kind of commerce. If you're someone who owns chametz and sells it, at what point must you stop selling it? Okay, so we are beginning to now wade into this question of selling, and it seems like selling chametz is permitted, but it's, at the very least, it is still debated. But now when we look at the Tosefta, and the Tosefta also is from the Tanaitic period, it's a compilation of Tanaitic texts that just didn't make it into the Mishnah. They weren't kind of canonized that way. But the Tosefta has a text that really now begins to introduce us to this potential question of selling in order to get out of owning. And there we read the following. A Jew and a Gentile that were traveling on a ship, and the Jew had chametz in his hand, in his possession. Behold, he may sell it to the Gentile, or he may give it to him as a gift, and then return and buy it from him after Passover, as long as he gave it to him as an irrevocable gift. And now we have seemingly a more general statement. A Jew is authorized to say to a Gentile, before you take this mana, which is 100 shekels of chametz, maybe you can even take 200. And if I need it, I will come and take it from you after Passover. So the first half of this Tosefta seems to be in describing a case which might be a kind of exigent circumstance. Potentially two people on a ship, but obviously ship journeys were more likely longer than just like a 3-day cruise or something. And so maybe it wasn't entirely certain when the voyage would end. And now Passover is about to arrive, and the Jew has all this chametz with them. So in kind of the normal course of life on land, you could just go ahead and you would probably be selling the chametz in kind of your everyday sort of day-to-day life and be able to get rid of it. But here, it's possible that that's not so easy to do, or I'd say more likely that you have a fair amount of chametz on this ship and you've got nothing that you can do with it other than own it, and to be forced to kind of destroy or get rid of all of it might be a heavy financial loss. So we see here that in this, again, exigent circumstance, we now begin to see a workaround, that you can sell it to the Gentile or give it to them as a gift, and then you can reclaim it after Passover. And the second half of this statement, which may be an extension of the first half, but seems like it has broader application, seems to be saying that not only are you permitted to do this, right, but you can really give someone a lot of chametz with what seems like it's the intention to then purchase it again after Passover. Meaning it's not just that you're trying to get rid of your chametz and have now money in exchange, but that you have this perhaps longer term intention of getting it back. So this seems to be, depending on who you are, maybe mildly troubling. This could seem like a really nice way out of this, but if the Torah told you that you shouldn't own chametz, you're just going to sell it to someone and then buy it back afterwards, it seems like you're trying to get away with something. And that certainly, I think, is somewhat true. And that introduces us to this general category of potentially ha'arama, or using a loophole to get out of something, and how we might want to think about this text. The Ritva is a medieval French commentator, and he says, he's Spanish, from the 13th century. He's a commentary on the Talmud, and he says the following. He says it's written in the Tosefta that we just saw that one may tell a Gentile to purchase the chametz at a higher price, and even insinuate that they will repurchase the chametz after Passover, but so long as one does not employ any kind of cunning, of ha'arama. This implies that if one does employ cunning, namely that one sells and repurchases the chametz annually, we penalize that person by prohibiting the sold items to any and all Jews after Passover, for we treat the food as though it belongs to the Jew, but is merely being guarded by the Gentile over Passover. So here we see that there's this notion of potential ha'arama, and I think actually the text that I have here just got cut off, so I apologize for that. But even the Tosefta itself is saying that one shouldn't employ ha'arama, this kind of cunning to kind of get around. And what he is describing as being this cunning is not the actual sale of the chametz in the first place, but it's if one goes ahead and does this annually. Now, it's not so obvious, as we're going to see in a moment, a challenge to the Ritva, that this should be the case, right? Meaning, why is just selling your chametz to buy it afterwards once fine, but doing it annually is more problematic? But potentially, one might argue that, sale itself, if you're doing it only one time, you're not 100% certain you're going to get it back. So maybe, there's not true circumvention happening there because there's some level of risk. But if you do this kind of year after year, then it seems as if you're now really beginning to kind of concretize or accustom yourself to this act, and then it really loses, the sale itself might lose any true intention or substance. And this is, in fact, what's written in the Beit Yosef. He challenges the Ritva, and he says, Rabbeinu Yucham wrote on the Tosefta in the name of the Bahag, providing he doesn't employ cunning. He's quoting someone else, and he says, I don't understand this. I don't understand his words. Since it is permitted to give the non-Jew chametz as a gift and then come and take it back after Passover, there's nothing more cunning than this, right? So he's disagreeing with the Ritva, and is basically saying, hold on a second, right? All of this seems like it's cunning. So why would we allow the circumstance which you do this annually, but we wouldn't allow you to do it in the first place? And he then continues to write, nevertheless, it's permissible only once it's left the Jew's domain entirely, and it becomes possible that he won't use cunning. And it appears from the words of the Trumat Hadeshen, who's another commentary from Austria, 15th century, that the giving of chametz to a non-Jew works only if it is a non-Jew who is not in his home. So there are a couple of points here that I think are important. The first is that the Beit Yosef here, who's Yosef Karo, who then goes on to also write the Shulchan Aruch, the major code of Jewish law in the 16th century. He basically says this whole thing is some kind of form of ha'arama, of circumvention. Nevertheless, we want to find a way where we limit the extent to which this is obviously some kind of circumvention. And specifically here, what he adds, this caveat, is that the food must leave the home of the Jew. So in theory, right, I could have something in my home and I could sell it to someone else, and it could just still continue to be in my home. I could take my AirPods case or my AirPods and sell it to someone and say, it's just going to remain in my home, but it's still yours and you own it. But according to this, to the Beit Yosef, this doesn't seem to be a sufficient kind of sale, because in this case, that really then conveys that this is just trying to circumvent the law. But if you actually have to take your food stuff and give it to the non-Jew and make a sale, they give you money, you give them the items, they take it home, right? Then even if your intention now is to go and repurchase this chametz later on, the fact that you've really gone through all the formalities of a sale, not just the formalities, but all kind of the standard practices of selling something to someone, makes this now at least appear as if it's much closer to being a legitimate sale. One might also argue in this case that it actually means that you're sort of less likely for the non-Jew you might be more likely for the non-Jew to say, I'm going to continue to hold on to this chametz because it's in his possession already. So if he's going to come and sell it back to you, that takes greater effort. But regardless, we are now seeing that we have the existence of this kind of circumvention that exists, this ha'arama, but exactly where we're drawing the lines on what makes it problematic and what doesn't is a little bit uncertain. And we see one potential caveat that this would need to, the chametz would need to leave one's home. Okay, but now we have another case, which seems to be its own kind of exigent circumstance, which comes from the Bach, who's sort of another legal commentary, 16th century, 17th century Poland, who writes the following. He says, in this country, in Poland, since the main business for Jews, I guess, is selling liquor, mostly because it's one of the few businesses that Jews were permitted to engage in, and it is impossible to remove all the liquor and equipment from the premises of the Jew. Because of that, it is permitted for the non-Jew to acquire the chametz in a room and also acquire the room itself. Right. So imagine what this means. You have kind of a distillery in your basement or in some kind of storehouse. And for you to go ahead and physically take all of the alcohol that you have and give it to the non-Jew as part of the sale and fully remove it, physically remove it, and then take it back, there might be risks in the transportation. It might be a significant amount of toil. Maybe the non-Jew is going to be less likely to engage in this. So here, there seems to be a greater allowance for actually now keeping this stuff in your home, but now you're also selling the room itself, or at least leasing it. So now it's not even really your home. You have this basement or this one particular room which is set aside, and neither the chametz that's in that room nor the room itself are continued to be your own. So you've kind of fulfilled all the requirements that are necessary in a formal sense. But the important point here, right, is that this alcohol comes from grain. That's why it's chametz, it's a palm, it says in bread. So here, I think we now see greater allowance for selling chametz, but we may also see the reasons for this, right? Before we were talking, it seems as if we were, thinking about a kind of regular person who has some amount of chametz in their possession. And so, we might be able to be more strict with what we allow them to get away with. Because sort of the worst case scenario is that a person might lose some relatively small amount of their personal stock of chametz. But here, this is someone's whole livelihood. Like, can you imagine if you had to fully get rid of all your grain product as a in a distillery and then start over again after Pesach? That might be too detrimental to your ability to function as a business. And so now there becomes this other counterbalancing value that may be encouraging the rabbis to try and be more lenient with regard to this sale. So where we stand right now is basically that we see in the Torah that there's a prohibition on owning chametz. We see that already going back to some of the earliest codes of Jewish law, there is a potential for selling your chametz and then purchasing it back, which we should strike us as being fairly radical, because even selling your chametz altogether, as we saw with the debate between Hillel and Shammai, was not obvious that you were permitted to do that, even though we rule like Hillel. Even selling your chametz that a non-Jew will own for their own consumption on Passover might actually be problematic. So all the more so if you're going to sell it to them and then repurchase it afterwards. Nevertheless, there seems to be at least some permission. Initially, in the most exigent circumstance where you're kind of trapped on a boat and you've got no other recourse other than, I guess, to throw all your food overboard. And that might also be a fair amount of sort of the luggage, whatever you're owning, and you're on this journey, there may be a greater amount than you would normally keep for your own personal use. But then we see that permission seems to get more expanded to this point that if it's your business, we may be willing to employ this kind of circumvention more broadly. At the same time, the rabbis do have concern for this being an easy way out. And so there are some mechanisms in place where we want to make sure that they're there so that this isn't a full ruse. And the two specific ones are that you would have to remove it from your home, or that you shouldn't do this year after year. So that's kind of where we stand here. The next couple of sources have been just referenced by the ones that we've seen already. And now we can turn to the Torah. The Torah is also an early medieval collection of Jewish law, kind of precedes the Shulchan Aruch. And there we see that this actually gets fully codified. That chametz of a non-Jew that passes through Pesach, meaning that the non-Jew owns throughout Passover, is permitted to be eaten. But if a Jew owns chametz on Passover, then even after Passover, it's prohibited to derive any benefit from, even if he held onto it mistakenly or because he's coerced. The idea here is this is a kind of punishment. We want to discourage people from owning chametz. So if you own it, then even afterwards, you're not allowed to eat it or have other people eat it. But if one sold it before Passover, gave it to a non-Jew as a complete gift, it is permitted. And he's permitted to say to him, instead of taking it for 100, take it for 200, and then I'll buy it back from you after Passover. Again, codifying this, that we are allowed to kind of go through this process where our intention is to repurchase it from the non-Jew. The Shulchan Aruch also similarly codifies this and says that if one sold it and gave it to a non-Jew who is outside of the house, and that's the important piece here, on Passover, even though the Jew sold it to a non-Jew and knows that he won't touch it and will guard it and give it back to him after Passover, he is permitted to do so long as he gives as a complete gift without any condition, or that he sells it to him as a real sale for a small amount. So again, here the Shulchan Aruch, though, is saying that there needs to be elements of a true sale that go on here. And again, this could be for two potential reasons. The first could be so that now there's a chance you're not going to get it back. So your intention has to be legitimate here. This is a real sale, and I know that the non-Jew is going to take it, and maybe they won't, follow through with this later on. Or potentially, this has to do more with this general sense of appearances, that we're going to allow you to circumvent this law, but there has to be, at least from the outside, a sense that you truly are selling this chametz. Okay, now one reason why this all may be allowed, and somewhat less of a circumvention than you might think, has to do with, it's actually the last page of our source sheet, but I didn't want to go through it together, but you have the sources there if you want, but actually have to do with another process that we have as we enter into Passover. And that is what many of us would do next Sunday night, which is search through our homes to try and find any leftover chametz. And now that's kind of a formal process that we do, but at some point that was a real process. And today you could say the general Passover cleaning is this process. Search through our homes to see if there's any remaining chametz and then get rid of it. And after we do that, we have another ritual, which is we verbally declare that any of the chametz that is left in our home is no longer ours. We relinquish ownership to the chametz. So why do we do that? So it appears that we do that because we're so concerned about owning chametz on Passover, right? That in case there was anything that I might have missed, I want to go ahead and declare that that chametz is not mine. Now, the Talmud and the commentaries discuss and sort of ask, hold on a second. If I can just declare that any chametz that's in my home is not mine and is now ownerless, then why do I even need to bother going through and looking for chametz in my home? Now, one reason is because of what we saw earlier, this thing of tashbitu, that you have to destroy your chametz. So there may be a positive mitzvah to find chametz and get rid of it, such that relinquishing it is not sufficient. But there are a couple of other reasons that exist, right? Imagine for a moment if you really did that, right? So you didn't clean your house at all for Passover, and you just declared all of the chametz that's in my possession is no longer mine. Then the next day you wake up, or 2 days later you wake up, and what do you see? You see that delicious donut from the other day that's sitting on your kitchen counter, and it's not your donut anymore, so you're not violating the prohibition of owning chametz, but you might be tempted to go ahead and eat that donut. You may also not even think about it, and you would come to eat that donut. And the prohibition of eating the chametz is not eating your own chametz, that's eating any chametz. So then maybe, even if you're going to relinquish ownership of the chametz in your home, you should get rid of all remaining chametz so that you are not, you won't come to actually eat any chametz. But there's another explanation also, which is that it's possible that the rabbis were concerned that that nullification that you were offering it relies upon your intention. It's not just that you're declaring, I now declare these these AirPods not to be mine, but I need to actually intend for that to be the case. Something which takes place balev, in the heart. And the heart and the mind are often linked in Jewish thought. So if that's the case, right? Well, what if someone actually didn't have the appropriate intention? They may have said, I no longer own all of the donuts that are in my home, or whatever it is, or the beer, but they actually don't really believe that. So we therefore have the added obligation to physically remove and get rid of the chametz from your home. So we have the verbal declaration, which is also internal, lest there's anything that we missed, but we also don't want to rely entirely on that stated intention, lest we don't fully believe what's going on. And so the Bechor Shor comes along here, Yosef ben Isaac Bechor Shor, and he writes the following. He says, it appears to me that the prohibition of kind of continuing to own chametz, I guess, is only a rabbinic one, since biblically it suffices to nullify one's chametz. And everyone nullifies their chametz with a whole heart. Therefore, they permitted the kind of sale mentioned in the Tosefta. So he basically is saying the following. He's saying that the active declaration that I no longer own the chametz is itself sufficient to kind of satisfy the biblical requirement of not owning chametz. And it's true, the rabbis wanted to be extra cautious. And as a result, I think I should say, right, and the rabbis just wanted to be extra cautious. So therefore, we also required you to get rid of your chametz, but really that's not necessary. So now when I go ahead and I sell the chametz to a non-Jew, that's really just an added layer of protection. And so that sale is not as radical as we may have initially thought. But the reason why this is important is because if you assume that the nullification that one does is not sufficient, right, then it seems as if maybe the sale would be a problem. But the only reason why the Bechor Shor thinks that this isn't a problem is because we have multiple layers of protection. There's the nullification that you do, which is renouncing your ownership. And then there's also the selling of the chametz. I mean, they happen in the reverse order, but you've sold most of your chametz, and that's okay because you were going to relinquish your ownership to it anyway. Now, I think what we ultimately have here, right, what we should understand is that there certainly is some kind of circumvention which is taking place here. And the only question is, how radical is that circumvention? According to Bechor, sure, it's not really all that radical because we're already relinquishing the chametz to begin with. But according to other commentaries and codes of Jewish law, that's not the case. And so we want to try and balance various values. We want to balance the requirement of the Torah not to own the chametz, which we want to take seriously, but also we understand that that could be a significant burden upon people, such that if we can, we may want to find a way to have a little bit of a loophole. And that gets us to a broader question in legal theory of why legal loopholes exist. And for that, I want to turn initially to Alana Stein-Haynes' book here, which I've quoted there. Again, we did a panel on this just the other day. And she begins by quoting a legal theorist, Frederick Schauer, in trying to understand the prevalence of legal fictions in common law tradition, right? These kind of legal fictions or workarounds, loopholes, they're not, purely a matter of Jewish religious law. They exist in all legal systems. And so he discusses why manipulating facts may be preferable to changing rules. So what does it mean to manipulate facts? So one example from this panel that a law professor, Jonathan Gould, offered was, we have speeding limits, but we have exemptions, say, for an ambulance. So what might be a way to not change the rule, but get around the rule? If I want to be able to speed, well, I could somehow classify my vehicle as being an ambulance, and now I can go ahead and speed. So I've sort of changed the facts, I manipulated the facts without actually changing the rules. Alana continues, in some legal systems, he argues, the idea of changing a rule is not palatable, right? So you could say, why not just change the rule? Because it's not going to be palatable. Additionally, changing a rule will affect the entire web of the legal system in unpredictable and perhaps undesirable ways. Consequently, it is often better to keep the rules as they are, but to engineer the facts of a situation for minimal disruption to the legal system. So just to understand what that means, right, if you're going to go ahead and completely change a law, there are going to be much more far-reaching consequences to changing that law. But if I just find this particular loophole, it's more likely that the effects of that employing that loophole are going to be only sort of narrowly contained. She continues, the degree to which rabbis felt authorized to change the law is subject to debate among scholars. So this is also an important point, of course, right? In, say, the American legal system, we have a whole process for legislation, but it's less clear that the rabbis felt, for instance, that they could just change the law and say you can own chametz on Passover. Nevertheless, that's actually not the fundamental point here, she continues, but even where they did, even where they felt they could change the law, it is possible that changing the law would be less palatable to practitioners. And what's more, their intervention in the law could cause unanticipated ripple effects in other situations. Changing a rule brings in its wake new questions and effects. Giving people a workaround, on the other hand, has fewer ripple effects, right? So there's a way in which owning, whatever we want to understand as being the importance of not owning chametz on Passover, right? We don't want to just willy-nilly get rid of that, but we also maybe need to find these kind of workarounds in circumstances where there is a counterbalancing value. And I think this actually is a really significant piece of a larger project of how we understand the evolution of law. And Alana continues by summarizing the position of Ronald Dworkin, well-known legal philosopher, legal theorist, who writes the following. She writes, but summarizing his point. She says, each judge is akin to an author writing the next chapter of a novel that has been co-written by earlier authors. And again, this is in general law. This is not about religious law. The new novelist must ensure that the narrative remains coherent, able to have been authored by one person, though in truth, it is authored by many. This means that the novelist will be bound to the previous chapters while having their own perspective about the general principles and ideology that run through the story. This is necessarily an interpretive process because each novelist in the chain will have an opinion about what does and should animate the novel. And yet these ideas must adequately explain earlier chapters. The ideas that animate the novel are the principles, and the degree to which these principles emerge from the law are imposed as organized principles of the law is ambiguous. So she basically is arguing the following, again, Dworkin's arguing this, that in many legal systems, we want to think of them as being coherent, right? If we just have them completely discontinuous, there's a sense that they lose legitimacy, they lose some of their authority. So we want to have a sense that the law as it was 10, 15, 20, 50, 100, 500, 1,000 years ago, depending on the system, is coherent and continuous today, as if it's kind of one novel. That's the analogy being made here, but it has multiple authors. And so what that means is every subsequent generation has to essentially employ their own interpretations, but in ways that while they might be novel, they need to still seem as if they are continuous with the past, as if they could have been written kind of by one singular author. And so in this case, right, how do we think about this in terms of loopholes? Well, to just completely go ahead and legislate a brand new law might seem as if that's too much of a break, too discontinuous to what came before. But employing the loophole allows there to still be some kind of continued sense of that law is that everything is kind of part of one longer united system. And Alana then goes on to describe a little bit more about how she thinks the rabbis, what their project is in employing loopholes. She says the rabbis manifest concern not only with the technicalities of the law, but with the principles that matter to the legal system as a whole. For example, not losing money due to religious obligation, not cheating the temple treasury when the temple existed, avoiding transgression, celebrating the festivals with food and drink, not cheating other people, not undermining people's respect for the law. These are broad principles the rabbis were concerned with. Whether in cases where ha'arama, the circumvention, is permitted because of its value-laden aims, or where it is disallowed, there are significant general legal principles at play. Rather than understanding ha'arama as a narrow interpretation of the statute being circumvented, the rabbis introduce an expansive view of the legal system as a whole. So what exactly is she arguing for here? If we take a look at the case of selling chametz, there are a number of major legal principles that are at play there. What are the rabbis concerned with? Well, not just this continuity that she mentioned before, this notion from Ronald Dworkin, but they're concerned with people having fidelity to the law and feeling like the law has true weight. And so to kind of just get out of owning chametz on Passover, what that itself is its own principle in Jewish law. At the same time, there's another significant value, which is we have concern for people's money. And if every year people just have to get rid of all of their chametz, and especially nowadays when we're able to hold on to more food and store more food than we could in the past, and even more so if you are someone who this is your business, you own a bar or whatever it is, right? It's not just that we don't care about the original law of not owning chametz, but we have another principle which is competing. And these two things are being weighed against each other. And so the rabbis are prepared to allow this kind of circumvention, not when it seems like someone's actually trying to get out of a law, but actually where the circumvention itself allows us to raise up another kind of meta value within the Jewish tradition or within the legal tradition. So we see lots of cases in which Jewish law takes into account people's money. We don't want them to lose their money. We have concern for that. Given that that's the case, and someone might lose a lot of money if they can't own chametz on Passover, we employ this legal workaround to make this possible. Okay, So I think we can skip back. Jonathan Gould, you can take a look at that. He's a legal scholar on this panel and how he talks about this in kind of the general system. He says something similar to what Alana just said. If we want to kind of take not just the loophole and only examine how does that sit with us, but let's think about the entire, both the workaround and any obstacles to that workaround, and how do we best preserve all of the values that are possible in this particular moment. I thought it was quite beautiful how the original author that we started with, Nathan Oman, who again is a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. He's a Mormon, and he purchased this chametz from Chaim Saiman, his friend, another professor. He actually thought that this, when he learned more about this was really a really powerful example of how Jewish law evolves, and maybe a lesson for law more broadly. And he writes the following. He says, Jewish law provides a marvelous example of a specific dynamic. Every legal system creates an imaginary world. The common law, for example, imagines a world divided by clear lines of property and planted thick with the obligations of tort and contract. What he means by imagined here doesn't mean it doesn't have significance, but it's that, you don't look out in the natural world and see a contract. That's a thing which has been imagined, which has been created. The world in which we actually live never quite corresponds to the law's imagined reality. Basically, it can't. The laws that we write, there's too much in kind of the everyday world, or just the real world, for the law to be able to perfectly instruct us in every moment. So he continues, legal remedies strive mightily to bring the two into alignment. But good lawyers understand this effort will always fail in the end. There will always be a gap between legal entitlement and what the legal system can actually deliver as a practical matter. The great 19th century jurist and historian Henry Sumner Maine claimed that legal systems change in one of three ways: by legislation, which we're most familiar with, by equity, or by fiction. Legislation is an idea familiar to laypersons, but equity and fiction in the legal context have specific meanings. Equity refers to a loose interpretation of a rule in order to achieve substantial justice. Fiction refers to the process of adapting legal rules by agreeing to pretend that their conditions have been met when in fact they have not. Right? So he's getting into some real legal questions here, but he's basically saying that there are three different ways in which laws can evolve. And the one that we think of the most is through legislation. As we saw before, it's possible the rabbis didn't always feel like they could legislate, but even where they could, there are other moments where we actually are going to either imply a kind of loose interpretation, right? Or we're going to have kind of this legal fiction, right? So maybe, I gave the example before of trying to reclassify, and Jonathan gave this the other day, reclassify my car as an ambulance, right? So maybe what I do is I just put a siren on top of it, and that's sufficient because some law describes that what's considered an emergency vehicle is anything that has a siren. And so even though I'm not actually using this for those purposes, maybe that would be sufficient. So that also would be a kind of workaround, rather than legislate that my vehicle is actually now allowed to speed. But all legal systems employ these kinds of mechanisms, and we've seen that they may actually be more beneficial than just changing the law, even where you can, because changing the law can have more far-reaching consequences. And Oman continues. He says, in my mind, it is the double-mindedness of the legal fiction that is brilliant. Sitting in the suburban garden in Philadelphia, it was impossible not to feel the authority of Jewish law, right? One might think that by circumventing the law, you then diminish the strength of that law or its authority, but he's saying the opposite. He continues, indeed, several members of the synagogue were there to witness the transaction with their children for precisely this reason. The forms and signatures literally had no other purpose than to comply with the demands laid down in Exodus. So it's really fascinating, right? If one were to carry out what seems to be the law on its initial kind of face interpretation, right? You got to get rid of your chametz. So that would be a somewhat simple process, right? As you start getting closer and closer to Passover, you stop buying any chametz, and maybe the last couple of bags of pasta or beer, you either have like a big chametz party the last couple of days, or you burn them, you get rid of them. That would be somewhat simple. But the mechanisms for actually selling chametz to the non-Jew are very, very involved. So I used to do this. Now one of my colleagues does it for the Orthodox and conservative, but it's open to anyone. Those are the ones who tend to come, the Orthodox community of Cambridge, where this process is extremely involved. We have basically half a dozen or more mechanisms of sale in order to make sure that the sale is actually legitimate. So people would come to me in the weeks before Passover. They would give me legal power of attorney to sell their chametz. And then on the day of, when the non-Jew would come, we would shake a hand to symbolize that we are going through a real transaction here. We would have a contract that was signed. I even went to buy from a coin collection store pure silver coins, so that we're actually using real silver in interaction. Plus, there's money that gets exchanged. Property gets leased so that there's access to the property for the non-Jew to go in and get their chametz. So there's a way in which we're doing all of that, which seems like they were going out of our way to circumvent the law or undermine the law, but it demonstrates that we have deep fidelity to the law, because otherwise, why bother with doing all of these procedures? Before we conclude with one final piece, I also want to say I did used to have concerns about these sales, or whether people actually took them, fully seriously. And some people will have a practice, if you own a pet and the pet food might be chametz, that you want to get rid of your chametz, but you have some still in your home that the cat or the dog is going to eat from, but then you also maybe have to sell the pet itself. You don't have to go into all the details of that. Just suffice it to say, there was someone in the community who owned 2 cats who wanted to sell her cats in order that she could then also have the cats eating their potentially chametz cat food. Anyway, about 3 or 4 days into Passover, I get an email from the non-Jew who had purchased the chametz and said, I would like to play with my cats. I bought these cats and they're mine. And I got really nervous because I sent an email to this person from the community and said, so-and-so wants to come play with their cats. And I didn't hear back. And I assumed that this person was like, what's going on here? I thought this whole thing is just kind of made up anyway. I'm not even going to bother responding. And so I got pretty disappointed that people aren't actually taking this seriously. But I actually found out like a week later that they just left me off of the rest of the email conversation. And a non-Jew, in fact, went over and played with their cats. One other funny anecdote from this, it was pretty easy to find people at Harvard's campus who were not Jewish to buy the chametz. I often would sit in on the graduate class each semester at the divinity school, and divinity school is filled with really warm interfaith people who were not Jewish and wanted to help out. So it was pretty easy to find someone. But one year I wasn't taking a class. I didn't know any grad students who weren't Jewish to help. So I asked an undergrad, can you find me a trustworthy, responsible, non-Jewish friend who's interested in doing this? And they, in fact, found someone. And only right before we went through with the sale did I realize that this person was underage. And most of they're 20 years old. And most of the chametz that we are selling is alcohol. And I got really nervous that A, this could be illegal, or B, that there could be some story that would be published in the Harvard Crimson, rabbi sells $20,000 worth of alcohol to a non-Jewish undergrad. So we made sure to always have someone who was 21 and older. One final piece that I want to just conclude here with was an idea that was actually raised at this panel the other day, but is mentioned in the foreword to the article that was published 2 days ago in Lair House that we've been quoting about this Mormon. That what's interesting is, in as much as we've now created this circumvention of the original law, the circumvention itself now becomes its own ritual. And Chaim Seiman, again, this law professor of Villanova, writes in the foreword to this article, he says, the sale of chametz transforms into a ritual act where virtually every formality known to both halakha and American law is invoked. In recent years, rabbis have even added a ceremonial component. inviting their communities to witness the transaction, using it as an educational opportunity to explain the laws of Pesach or Passover as they relate to the sale of chametz. So this whole thing, which seemed as if it was circumventing the law, now becomes this incredible opportunity to potentially teach, for people to come and engage in this ritual, to observe the ritual and to learn new things. And the other piece to this also, I've seen that a lot of rabbis feel, especially since COVID, that people aren't coming to synagogue as much, and they've lost some touch, and they try and keep up, but they can't always. But one of the main times that people come is because they want to sell their chametz, and they do that in person. And so this actually becomes a wonderful opportunity for rabbis to continue to be in relationship with their constituents, even if they might otherwise have lost touch. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, stopping the live stream also.